Hello, and welcome to the Imposter Syndrome Network podcast, where everyone belongs, especially if you think you don't. My name is Chris Grundeman, and a quick note, our beloved Zoe Rose has decided that quality time with her two children, one of them a newborn, needs to take priority for a while. While I know we'll all miss her on the podcast, I'm also sure that all of you will join me in wishing her well. She'll be back, but it will be a couple of months, so I'll stop mentioning her absence after this episode. And what an episode this will be. It's the Doug K episode. Doug is a self-branded security-minded network engineer with past roles at Juniper, Cisco, Gigamon, Nokia, and now at Arista. He's witnessed the vendor community continue to develop remarkable products during his 30-year career. The recent shift from pre-sales back to post-sales has made his job fun again, permitting him to focus on implementing reliable, secure solutions for customers. Hey, Doug, would you like to introduce yourself any further to the Imposter Syndrome Network?
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. Yep, I just said Doug K, like very short last name that nobody can spell. So it's always K-A-Y, and my kids have to go through that same thing. It's whatever their name is, K, right? Morgan Ryland, right? So yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.
Awesome, cool. Well, let's dive right in here. We connected through a mutual friend, Scott Robon. How do you know Scott?
Yeah, so let's see, I met Scott in 2004 when I was started at Juniper and Juniper Federal. And Scott was, if I recall, he was running the federal TAC at that point with another colleague who was a close friend. And we just stayed in touch over the years through multiple people and really great connecting with him. I actually ended up working with him at Nokia, where he was my boss for a little bit. We stayed in touch, and was fortunate enough to go to NAF, which you and Scott started, maybe along with some others, and what a great experience it was. So yeah, huge fan of Scott, and in the super small world, I live in Annapolis, and right down the street was a company that Scott taught at prior to Juniper called Chesapeake Computer Consulting. And it's literally down the street from my house. And I used to go there all the time. And, people you've had on your show, Terry Slattery and others, they're all founders of that. So I am pretty sure, though I don't remember, that Scott probably taught a intro to Cisco something way back in the day.
Very cool. Yeah. It's wild how we kind of continue to bump into each other over these decades-long careers in different places and with different hats on and things.
For sure.
And speaking of that, I think, as I mentioned in the intro there, you've worked at kind of, maybe not quite all the greats, but a lot of the great kind of networking companies. Why don't you run us through kind of your career? Obviously, they could be a very long story, 30 years across a lot of companies, but maybe, the 60-second version of, Doug K's journey through technology so far.
Sure. Yeah.
And I won't time you, so don't worry about the 60 seconds.
So, maybe even going farther back, I started out doing computers way back when, just for what it's worth. For my 13th birthday, I got a 386 computer. I did have the fortunate luck that my dad worked for Intel starting in 1977, 1978. We had a computer at home when probably very few people had computers at home. So I grew up in the, as my dad would say, golden age of PCs, but started doing Windows and then Novell in the early 90s, almost said 80s. And then got into Microsoft, and then ultimately took a job in New Jersey at a company called Allied Signal, which is now part of Honeywell. And really, really exciting. I'll get to the vendor stuff too. Really exciting on my first week there, and I was a Novell guy. They said, "Hey, this is the network guy. This is his last week. Learn everything you can from him." So that was kind of my get thrown in. So I knew about IPX routing a little bit, right? From you have a server with two NICs, right? And you do routing, or maybe you turn it off as being the better approach. Don't do routing on a server back then. Then it moved on to, came back to Maryland after about 2 years, ended up at a .com, fortunately in Annapolis, close to home. And the big lure there was sale at work, right? And so they were luring people. This was 1998. They were luring people with the, hey, live the Annapolis lifestyle. It's fun. We have sailboats. The company bought sailboats. It was throwing money. everywhere. And they had already started it, but built up this large Cisco network to do what some people would say was the forefront of cloud, which was application hosting. And really great experience. Moved on, had some good mentors there, including one that ended up at Juniper, Andrew Liu. And Andrew helped me find many jobs, but he also helped me get a job at Juniper along the way, and ended up in federal and helping out with DoD. And great company. Wanted to be a bit more hands-on. It was kind of interesting. I got hired the week that Juniper, and I'm sorry, this is going way over 60 seconds. I got hired the week that Juniper bought NetScreen. And that was my first experience going someplace where there was an acquisition. They said, hey, everybody's got an offer. You're going to get it. You'll start, but you just made it.
Oh, wow.
And so I wanted to do pure routing as all the people at Juniper did. And then I ended up getting stuck, if you will, stuck for what it's worth, doing firewalls and whatnot and routing. And NetScreen was really ahead of its time in that way. But I brought that routing and firewall experience with me from my .com job, and ultimately ended up moving on to Cisco, going to what Cisco called the WEP, Wireline Emerging Provider, and supported XO Communications for 3-ish years. Really great job, good people. Got to help compete against my former employer, Juniper, and got some Cisco CRS-1s in there, and made some great relationships, including some of the people you've had on your show. So that was good. Then I decided to go off on my own and become a government contractor because I was tired of working 60 hours a week at Cisco and just wanted to try something new. And I think,
did that work? Did you actually work less hours as a contractor than you had as an employee?
Yeah, so great point. I did, but I didn't enjoy it. And so I wanted to be busy. Oddly, that was one of my longest jobs. Just one of those things where I didn't want to give up on it, but it just wasn't a good fit from the beginning. And there were, speaking of imposter syndrome, I had a lot of doubts once I got there, really from day one, but I just kept plugging away, even knowing it wasn't a great fit. But then went back to Cisco, was there covering a DoD customer for a few years, then moved on, had a couple little stints after Cisco, ended up at Gigamon, which was, I didn't know what a network packet broker was at the time. I dealt with security. I dealt with span ports and those type of things. And man, what a really interesting product. And it's just amazing how they grew that. They really created that market, in my opinion, from what I could tell. And it came out of doing taps and building taps. Then it was just the next thing. And, really good marketing, the orange boxes. What a great idea. And the story was that, I think it was AOL said, we can't find your boxes in our data center. Paint them some color. And they painted them orange.
Wow.
And the first ones were spray painted orange.
That's awesome.
Yep. Then from there, moved back to routing, if you will, Nokia and Nokia Federal, and had a great opportunity to help with 5G and actually help do a small private 5G cell install at Department of Energy out west. And that was really an eye opener. Didn't know what I was doing, but they needed somebody out there to help install. And, it started all making sense, right? And understanding, hey, this phone in my home, this phone in my hand, if you will, how we're going to make things work. And then ultimately ended up, had some life changes, and pre-sales was just not working out for me. And every time, and I give Nokia lots of props for this, ultimately, I was on a project that was a pilot of sorts, or a POC. And when we were talking about OSPF and BGP and all these things, I'm like, oh man, it's taking me back. And I considered trying to shift to a professional services job at Nokia, but just wasn't the right move. And at the time, this opportunity came to go to Arista and do post sales. And it's been great. It's like going back 20 plus years and being hands-on router jockey, if you will. And they treat us super well, and the products are solid and the customers like it. And, it's not a huge stretch after working at these different vendors. And from a configuration standpoint, it looks like iOS for the most part. So not too hard to adopt, and working closely with customers. is great. And I get to be a little bit of a link to the account team as well, so I keep my hand in pre-sales just a little bit, even though the post-sales has happened. And hopefully I can pass along some information about, whether it's a certain type of optic the customer needs or a need for network observability when they were upgrading from 10 to 100 gig or 400 gig, and they don't have the taps in place, or if you will, the packet broker infrastructure to do those upgrades. So security kind of catching up around the network.
Awesome. That's cool. So it sounds like you started hands-on, which I think a lot of people do, obviously, and then moved into the more pre-sales type roles, more kind of consultative, I guess maybe talking about technology more than doing it. And that hunger to kind of get back into the nuts and bolts and do it hands-on is what led you to Arista. Can you tell me more about kind of that desire to move from pre-sales back to post-sales and be more hands-on?
Yeah. Well, I think, one thing somebody could say is when you're in sales, your account manager can be your best friend or your worst enemy, or somewhere in between, right? And pressure flows and quotas and whatnot. And I always found myself more interested in the solution. And having been that customer, if you will, in the past, maybe going back to my .com days at USI in Annapolis, and somewhere in between as a contractor, I really was trying to come up with creative ideas. One of the things on my LinkedIn page says I try and do more with less. So if there was a creative thing I could do with a router to avoid buying 2 more routers, right? Whether it be, hate to use the term policy-based routing, or if you will, some QoS function, whatnot. I was just always focused on that and very customer focused, almost to the point where it could be, I don't want to say it was detrimental, but it could have been, right? Where I was just taking on that I am the customer thing, even though I wasn't. And so that really kind of, I was thinking to myself, how do I make this all work? And it just, between that last POC, if you will, at Nokia, and spending a lot of time thinking and then looking for jobs out there, this one popped up, and I'm just, post sales. Why not?
Awesome.
And it's been a return to my roots, if you will. And, for somebody who got into being a sales engineer, it was like the, if you will, sexy thing in town, right? It had the commission, it was exciting, and had a lot of excitement in my career doing that. But just over the last, I hate to say, 5 to 10 years, it just wasn't as exciting as it used to be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can see, the shine does wear off of things, even really, really great things, I think. As I get older, I start to see more and more these things when I was young that I thought would be like the thing forever, or the pinnacle or the ultimate, turn out to be, potentially interesting, but maybe not the forever thing, for sure. And kind of thinking in those terms, listening to your story, I was struck by, it sounds like repeatedly you kind of got thrown into the fire, whether that was intentional or not. Right. So even at that first job at Allied Signal, you show up and the guy's leaving and they're like, all right, you're a network engineer now, figure it out. Going to Juniper, they're like, oh, we're buying NetScreen. You're a firewall engineer now, figure it out. I think there's even 1 or 2 more examples in there of the Nokia with the mobile networks and kind of figuring that out right away, which maybe is not completely atypical of a career in digital infrastructure and kind of IT type things. Things change and you have to grow and learn. But not everyone does that. I think some people kind of stick to one path. Has that kind of, at least from my perspective, like being forced to learn on the fly, has that ever caused you problems, or do you really love that, or does that come with some maybe imposter syndrome, as you mentioned, right? Feelings of not quite getting it right away, or maybe we talk through that process of that, being thrown into the fire like that, or maybe you don't see it that way.
So I would say I've never been risk adverse, sometimes to my own detriment. Certainly getting thrown into the fire caused me to lose a lot of sleep. I remember another story. I was at Juniper, and one Friday, I think they told me, hey, we need you to go to the Moon IPv6 testing. And maybe it was Denver. I think it was out west. And I'm like, oh God, I don't know anything about IPv6. So I spent the whole weekend with a Olive box and a bunch of logical routers, then called logical routers, I think, and set up IPv6. And I was asking Jeff Doyle questions, probably dumb questions at the time, working at Juniper then. And then I didn't have to go, and it was, man, what a relief. But I also was fortunate to end up there was a US government IPv6 conference in DC, and my boss let me set up the IPv6 connectivity. It was working with Sprint, bringing in a Juniper router, dealing with DHCP or lack of DHCP v6 at the time. And it was really, really, really fun. But, at the same time, it was scary. It kind of messed with my sleep. But, no pain, no gain. And that's what I try and teach my kids. It's tough because things come so easy these days. Right. The $1,000 phone, right?
Yeah.
The $2,000 computer.
Yeah. As you said, right. You were lucky, I think, there was definitely an uneven dispersion of technology. I think there still is, but it's much more, ubiquitously available for sure. And then that technology taps into all these things. We've talked about on the show several times in the past, just the fact that when folks of our age got into technology, there was no YouTube. There wasn't even like a Google, a search engine. There definitely wasn't TikTok or LinkedIn or any of these places where you can or Twitter or whatever, wherever you go get your information and meet other people and learn how to do these things. None of that was available, right? It was just straight up, hopefully read a Cisco press book and, maybe find some RFCs. And if you're lucky, somebody on the team knows some stuff that can kind of teach and mentor you. And they're willing to, without just being gruff and telling you to figure it out on your own. Because I got a lot of that when I was younger, for sure. So yeah, it is a lot easier now. And on that point, I mean, you've mentioned your kids a couple of times. Obviously, being a father is important to you. Has fatherhood influenced your career at all? I mean, are there things you've taken from your career that have made you a better parent, or things that being a parent have made you better in your career? Or does that interaction happen?
I would say yes. So I probably started off emulating my parents. And so my dad worked for Intel for 20 years, and he was a workaholic. He came from a long line of workaholics, traveled once a month. My mom was stuck dealing with 3 kids most of the time. Fortunately, my dad worked from home, so he had that privilege in the 80s and the 90s. But that's what I was used to. So my wife at the time took care of the kids, and I went off to work, and that's what it was. And I used to think about my time at Cisco, and I would say it jokingly at the time. Now it's not a joke. I'm like, what was I thinking? But I would say I would take time off. This is my first stint at Cisco. I would take time off from work to spend time with my family. Really pretty backwards, right? Thinking. But at the time, that was what I thought I was supposed to do.
Yeah.
And I remember this great quote from somebody at Juniper, and it was before I was married. I was engaged at the time. This is going back before Cisco. It took me a long time to really get it. He's like, everybody has something that they really care about in this world that's important. And I'm like, he's going to say work or money. He said family. He was a few years older than me, had some older kids, and I had no kids at the time. And I'm like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that. So it took me a long time to really deal with that. And in many ways, I leveraged work as kind of my satisfaction or source of validation, if you will. And, I think people in the tech industry are validation seekers. Seeking validation and then not getting it, I think, speaking of the podcast, really leads into imposter syndrome. And so I went through some tough times, just moving on, thinking, things will be better. I'm going to get what I want here. I want to become a government contractor, thinking I could really offer a lot of change. And boy, I had a surprise for me. And I was hoping I could bring like service provider, if you will, best practices to government. And that was an uphill battle for sure, including an interesting project that I thought was interesting that would really help a lot, that ultimately nobody wanted to succeed. And there were a few of those in the government, including the seniors, if you will, the SESs that were in charge of them. Some of them, that they didn't want it to succeed, or they were pushing, but there would be contractors or other government people that didn't want it to succeed. And I had never worked in an environment quite like that. In the .com, we were going to succeed. At Cisco, John Chambers had a great saying, never lose alone. And big believer, but in the government, it was just very different. And, definitely led to some imposter syndrome. But getting back to then, I'm if you will, I stuck myself in this job. It paid well, but I didn't enjoy going to work for those 40 hours a week. And it was tough to bill for 40 hours a week. And then I didn't have the relationship with my kids that I wanted at the time. And it took me a lot of tough times, if you will, that some families go through to figure out how to build that relationship and not make work secondary, though to some degree it has been but make the kids first for sure, and take that attitude that my old boss had said about Andy, about making, what's the most important thing? What's the thing that everybody cares about?
Yeah, I like that a lot. It reminds me, I may have told this story on the podcast before, but one of the guys I worked with early on, one of the first ISP I was building, he was actually a retired emergency room doctor that was an investor in the company, and we worked together building this ISP. Anyway, I've always been a very intense person. I think it sounds, similar, right? I think my dad was also a workaholic, and I kind of stepped into that and kind of followed the same way. And I've always taken my work very seriously. I think maybe less so now in some good ways, but that intensity and kind of drive and maybe the same thing, right? Seeking that validation from the job I was doing led to, stress and anxiety and just kind of, not quite totally freaking out, but definitely being on edge, maybe being frustrated, maybe being openly angry sometimes when it didn't really need to be, or I didn't really need to be. And anyway, this gentleman told me once that he said, just remember, what are they going to put on your tombstone, right? He said, hopefully, if you're lucky, they're going to say, loving father, caring husband, great friend, right? What they're definitely not going to say is, expert, CLI troubleshooter. That's probably not going to go on your tombstone, right? It's not the big important thing. And that really helped me kind of refocus. At that time, it was more just kind of letting some of that stress go and not taking it so seriously. Later on, I realized maybe putting family first was also more important, and friends first, and not putting work above everything else. That took me a long time as well to kind of get around to that.
No, it's a growth thing. I'm happy to have it. And, I think my life is more balanced, and I've been able to get into kind of different hobbies that always either I didn't have the time or the time, patience, or faith in myself to try and execute. So it was always about work or what can I earn? If I get this job and I make this much, I can buy the next car that I want.
Yeah, right. I know that hamster wheel very well, I think.
Yep. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough chasing the dime, so to speak.
Yeah. So, without kind of going back against that, I think, looking at your career so far, what would you say is the greatest achievement you've had kind of within that bounds of work and career?
It's a tough one because it was so far back. I like to hope that I have done more since then. But I would say at the time, getting my CCIE in 2001, it was during the .com and into the .bomb, if you will, working with 2 or 3 guys on my team at the .com USI, and we were all going for it. And I passed on the 3rd time, and it was just one. Good. Yeah, it's average. I'll take it.
Yeah.
First time I wasn't prepared. Second time I just did something really dumb, and third time I made it probably by the skin of my teeth. But during that time, and it was really, I learned some good lessons about time management. So during the last time, I think it was May, 2001, I got laid off from USI. And I had my CCIE scheduled. I'm like, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
How am I going to look for a job and pass this test?
Mm-hmm.
I can't do it. And so I just set out a schedule. During the day, I would look for a job on I think I might have still been using a fax modem at that point to send out resumes. During that time, I would look for a job during the day, certain hours. And then at night I would study and on the weekends, and I passed, but I developed some good habits and things I want to impart on my kids of separating things, how you can get more things done. One of the things I always say is what I learned from that experience was don't send emails on Monday morning. Don't send them Friday. Try not to send them Friday. Send your resume in. Don't ask for anything at those times because people aren't going to process. And I saw it
Yeah.
through looking for a job. And so it was perfect. And passed the test, felt like a hero, came back. USI gave me a job in the NOC as a contractor for X number of months. And I had like just the most fun that summer possible. So I went from being one of the 3 network guys to
Awesome.
being in the NOC.
Hmm.
And it was tough as well. So I had fun, but I really wanted my old job back, and I just wasn't mature enough to accept that time had passed.
Yeah.
So it took me a little bit to kind of find my way, and I went to a post.com, which was the hope of where, God, if I didn't work 60 hours a week, I'd probably work 70 or 80. And that was just something I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to put in those 2 years, and it just didn't work out. And but fortunately, I was able to build a network from scratch. That was actually the first time I did it. I had a team of people. I learned I was a bad manager at the time and haven't pursued management since then, though mentoring I'm open to. And I got to build the network. I got to use Juniper and help me get my job at Juniper, I hope.
Fantastic. Well, that's cool.
And that was a good launch into the vendor community.
Yeah. Well, speaking of not wanting to let things go, but having to, we'll have to leave it there today.
Okay.
Doug, do you have any projects or causes you'd like to let us know about? I think you're starting a podcast maybe sometime soon.
Yeah. My best friend and I are starting a podcast. There's some inspiration from you, of course, and others. And I'm big into podcasts where we're going to talk to people about cars. I'm a big car fan. I have kind of 2 of my dream cars for what it's worth. 1990 Nissan 300ZX, which was the car I wanted in high school, which for another time indirectly got me into Novell, and then where I am today.
Oh.
And so I ended up buying that 30 years later.
Nice, yeah.
And I have a DeLorean also.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
So I've not done a lot of mechanical work on it, but a lot of electrical. My dad was double E, so I learned a bit from him. I've had the car break down multiple times. It's been at a friend's house for 6 months while he's doing suspension work because I'm not comfortable doing that. But that car has been, and I'd like to write a memoir kind of about that, but that car has been, if you will, that car has been the best therapy I think money could buy. And I could be in that, working on that car, and hear my late father, in talking, and I'm working on doing some electrical work and using a soldering iron, and that he got me my first one when I was 7 years old because he couldn't get me to put his down, and I kept burning my hand. So the podcast, and really just want to do mentoring. I'll finish up with a quick story. I had somebody, Uber driver, give me a ride one time, and nice kid, like in his 20s, and he's telling me about all the time he spends playing games and being a gamer, but he wanted to be a dump truck driver. And I'm like, dude, you live in Maryland, like NSA and all these other agencies are here. You have grown up with the internet and all these things that I didn't have. They need a next generation of people like you. I don't know if he did anything different, but that's what I really want to do.
Yeah.
The car thing is just fun. If I can interview people and talk to them about their cars and share my story, hey, even better.
Heck yeah. Yeah. A lot of our lives are like, I'm a car guy as well. And I think a lot of my stories, at least especially early on, my dad were spent out in the garage handing him wrenches and stuff. So
yeah,
definitely interested to hear that when it comes out.
Yeah.
Doug, thanks so much for sharing your story with the Imposter Syndrome Network. Yeah, it's been fun. Thank you to all of our listeners for your time, your attention, and your support. If you found this episode insightful or interesting, or even just entertaining, please consider paying it forward by letting others know about this show and the great guests we have on. Thanks again, Doug. I think we're going to leave it there today. This was really awesome. I appreciate you coming on and enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, look forward to talking to you again offline.
Absolutely. And we will be back next week. Doug K looks pretty easy to pronounce. Make sure I'm not screwing that up. All right, good.
Yep. Yeah.
It's funny. Like sometimes I have people on who I've known for like a decade or more, and find out that I've been saying their name wrong the whole time. So I always ask no matter what.
Yep. No, I get it. I get it. I know Mr. Robon. Nobody gets his name right. And then he just says like putting a robe on, and everybody gets it.
That helps. Yeah.